Thank you, Alicia. Hi, everyone. I'm Wynette Tasker, the Children and Youth Program Coordinator at Redwind Consulting. Redwind is a national, tribal, technical assistance provider working with the Office on Violence Against Women. We offer a variety of trainings and consultations, either on-site or one-on-one, through email and phone calls. We can provide assistance for children and youth on topics such as domestic violence, teen dating violence, sexual assault, trafficking, and stalking. Thank you so much for joining us today for our second in the series of Children and Youth webinars. If you missed the first one on domestic violence exposure, it will soon be archived on our website at red-wind.net. Today's webinar is on teen dating violence, and it will review warning signs, long-term impact, safety planning, and how to get teens engaged. I'm honored to be able to introduce Redwind's very own Cinnamon Ronneng as our presenter today. Cinnamon has provided leadership and collaboration with sexual assault response teams throughout her 14 years of working for systems change. Her leadership and collaboration developed protocols for child protection and local domestic violence and sexual assault agencies. She's currently Redwind Consulting's program coordinator. She assisted in the facilitation and development of the OVW Tribal Sexual Assault Medical Forensic Examination Protocol and Tribal Sexual Assault Response Team trainings. She has done regular web trainings, organized sexual assault exam trainings and sexual assault response team trainings, coordinated consultants, and provided site visits to programs, assisting them with a wide range of tasks that included developing SARTs, sexual assault protocol development, and providing a variety of community outreach tools. She has been a proud member of Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition since 2001 and has been a circle keeper, which is a member of their board, from 2004 to 2010 in attempts to help improve systems of social change. She has organized a group of 47 teens across 4 towns and 1 reservation to provide dating violence awareness called TADA, or TADA, which is Teens Against Dating Abuse. In rural and reservation areas, she coordinated the development of multidisciplinary response protocol for adult sexual assault victims. She provided professional, community, and volunteer educational trainings locally and at state and national conferences. She developed a tribal sexual assault advocacy program and worked in a tribal shelter while participating in rural and reservation SART. She has twice assisted in drafting Violence Against Women Act resolutions in 2003 and at the National Congress of American Indians Conference. She's a Dakota and she's from rural Minnesota, currently residing in Colorado. She's a proud mother of 2 young men, and she's now a grandma too, and family continues to be the center of her life. And with that, I will pass it along to Cinnamon. Thank you.
Thank you, Wynette. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad you could join us today. Like Wynette said, our focus is on teen dating violence. And so one of the things that I'm going to do is we'll go through some of the slides, and then we'll break for questions. So please write down your questions or go ahead and type them in the chat box, and we'll filter through them halfway through the presentation so we can stay on task. And hopefully, as we move forward, some of them will get answered. So we're talking about teen dating violence, and it's the physical, sexual, psychological, or emotional violence within a dating relationship, and it does include stalking. So I want to make sure that we're all using the same terminology and having the same clarification as far as what we're talking about. When we talk about statistics, I'm going to just start with that, just because I know people like to hear statistics, and we have a couple listed up here on the PowerPoint, and we'll talk a little bit about them. But I wanted to make sure that you all know that we're still in the infancy stages of gathering true statistics, and that's just because of access to grants specific for tribes, or the way information is gathered in urban and off-reservation areas. Many times we get put in the other category. So we don't have a good grasp yet on Native youth and dating violence statistics. So I just wanted to point that out. And I think for those of you that have or are in the middle of developing your teen dating violence program, that's an important thing that you can make sure your community is doing as you gather information, so that everyone's on the same page, and then we can use those statistics that'll better help us get an idea of what's really happening to our Native youth. Typically, violent behavior starts between the ages of 12 and 18, and girls and young women between ages of 16 and 24 are experiencing the highest rate of intimate partner violence, and that almost triples the national average. Suicide attempts are much higher. We already know that as well, especially on our reservations for teens that are experiencing violence. 50% of the teens that were abused compared to 12.5 that are non-abused have suicide attempts. So we know the rates are much, much higher for youth, and they're even higher for youth that are in those violent relationships. Teen victims tend to minimize the seriousness of the situation, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, about minimizing or thinking that jealousy perhaps means that that person loves them. We'll talk a little bit about minimizing the situation, because it happens in many different ways. We also know that only 33% of the teens that have experienced dating violence have told someone about it. And who are they telling? They're telling their friends. So it's important that that us as advocates or working in this field or have the child and youth programs are doing some education on this topic, because if they're going to their friends, we want their friends to be able to help them. So having an appropriate intervention policy or process that we're teaching the youth is an important factor in healing of both the perpetrator and the victim, because we know this is a learned behavior, and if it's a learned behavior, it can be unlearned. And I think that youth are, because they're still growing, that we have a better opportunity to intervene in a healthy way if they're doing this as a young adult. Some of the things we want to think about is shelters and what our policies are. I'm not sure the participants that are on this call, how many of you have shelters in your area, and identifying or talking with the shelters to find out if they're even housing teens and teen boys, and what are some of their policies around that. Most of the times what we've been finding over the last few years is shelters are not prepared to handle teen dating violence. So there are limited options for safety if the victim attends school with the perpetrators as well. And we'll talk about this as well as what can we do as first responders or intervention advocates to help prepare the schools to set policy or protocol in place if they have a perpetrator and a victim within that school. We know that violent relationships in adolescence places the victim at higher risk for participating in risky behaviors such as substance abuse, risky sexual behaviors, as well as experiencing domestic violence in the future. And I also want to refer you to Red Wind website. We have a list of fact sheets that are available for you to download, as well on teen dating violence, human trafficking of Native youth, Native children and youth exposed to violence, and then sexual assault and Native youth fact sheets. So please check them out as well. That's a great resource. We also know with girls and women ages 12 to 34, they have the highest risk of being sexually assaulted. And we know that similar to adults, they're sexually assaulted by somebody they know, or acquaintance, or a date rape. Many times it's an expectation as youth. I know I didn't think I was too out of touch with youth when I had worked with the youth group back in 2005, and found out very quickly that I was a little bit more out of touch than I had thought. One of the things that I was able to do, I was fortunate enough to be part of, was youth camp, and we did that every year, and we learned new stuff every year from the youth. And one of the things that we found out was that the youth really, it was accepted behavior, where there was sexual pressure from a dating partner, and that even oral sex was considered similar to kissing. It was minimized that much. And we're going to talk about what we can do to intervene in some of that risky behavior. I know just in the neighboring town where I live, they canceled their last football game, which was an important game, and it was because they were sending pornographic pictures of themselves to each other and passing them throughout the school. So there's some things that we can do as community members, as individuals, as family, as school, you know, if we have access to the schools, and can set some of those policies in place. 88% of the offenders of all violent crimes against Indian women are non-Indian. Native teens are 3 times more likely to be sexually assaulted than any other demographic. A teen in Indian country is more likely to be sexually assaulted facilitated by drugs or alcohol. And I think alcohol, what we have found, history has shown that that's probably one of the most used date rape drugs. Native youth who have been sexually assaulted are more likely to engage in risky behavior, drop out of high school, suicidal, and suffer from teen pregnancy. And we also know that teen dating violence occurs with the same frequency as marital violence. And that's kind of scary, knowing that you have that pattern of abuse, whether it's an adult or a teenager, that the abusers use that same pattern and that same frequency. So let's just talk about some of the long-term impact of dating violence. Although it's similar to adults that are in abusive relationships, there are some differences because I think as youth they're a little bit more limited with their choices and responsibilities compared to adults. So we know there's a fear factor, and the one thing that I talk about is, well, I'm only scared if he's drinking. I'm only scared if I am talking to a male friend of mine because he's jealous. I'm only scared if he's had a bad day. Well, you should never ever feel scared of your partner or anyone. And that's probably one of the things that I reiterate to youth whenever I have an opportunity to work with them is, you know, feeling scared and feeling scared often or only when he drinks or only when he has a bad day or, you know, whatever it is, if they've identified when they feel scared, then it's gone too far. Injury. Many times we know that injury, that abusers will injure their victim in places or ways that others can't see. They twist their arm, they might twist their leg, they might pull their hair, they might slam their head against the wall or, you know, the dashboard in the car, or they're going to do things that others can't see it. They try not to leave bruising or leave physical marks because of it. And we know with head injuries, it's coming out more and more, even with football. They're talking about the football players, you know, and the concussions and the traumatic brain injuries that they are getting out on the field with playing football. And it doesn't take much. So, you know, if we know based on those statistics that we had talked about that youth are not telling people, they're not even telling, you know, their close friends, that only 33% of them are telling anyone, you know, that's scary when it's a severe violent relationship. And, you know, part of their fear might be retaliation if they do tell. They doubt, victims will doubt their abilities They doubt their feelings. They doubt the choices and decisions that they make. And very similar to adult situations where there's abuse in the relationship is they put that doubt in their minds that they can't accomplish something, or they're stupid, or they're inferior, or they need to depend on the perpetrator, on the abusive partner, because they know best. And they make better choices, and they're smarter, or those sorts of things. We talk about isolation, same thing with teens. You know, they might give up certain friends. I had talked a little bit about isolating from male friends, maybe because their partner is jealous or shows jealousy. So they give up their friends because they want their partner to feel comfortable in their relationship. And, you know, the partner, the abusive partner might be saying, hey, you know, I don't want you talking to Joe anymore. You know, a guy knows another guy, and he likes you, and he's trying to scoop in, or whatever it is, and I just don't want to lose you. Well, you know, as victims do, they start believing them. It's told to them over and over, and they want to keep the peace. They want to maintain their relationship. They want their partner to feel secure, and so they start giving up certain friends. Even girlfriends, you know, the abusive partner might encourage the girlfriend, the teenage girlfriend, to give up her girlfriends because maybe they drink too much, or maybe they're promiscuous, or maybe they're none of that, but he says that they are, and you can't convince him otherwise. So you're going to give them up just to keep the peace in the relationship. And so you slowly start being isolated from your friends. That may also include things such as after-school activities or sports, that sort of thing as well. Because maybe he just wants to spend all of his extra time with you, and, you know, is feeling like you don't love him enough because you're taking your time with your friends or your sports or your after-school activities. And we see that in different ways in adult relationships also. And then similar to the shame and guilt with adults is the same for the youth and teen dating violence. There's an element of shame. There's an element of guilt that goes along with it. You don't want to talk about it with anyone, even your closest friends, because you don't want them to know what's going on. You don't want them to think he's a bad guy. You know, you really like this guy. You think he could be the one. All of those same things. Or what did I do to deserve that? You know, that shame that goes with it, that embarrassment. If anybody knew, oh my gosh, you know, what kind of person am I to put up with this, or what did I do to deserve this? Because especially with youth, they're not maybe categorizing what's happening to them. You know, they're trying to figure it out. And if we see it in our community, if we see domestic violence happening around us, if we're living in it in our homes, it's accepted behavior in the community, As teenagers, you are influenced by what's going on around you. And although accepted, you might not like it, but it's accepted behavior. And some girls kind of just throw in the towel and say, yeah, I don't like it, but I know that's how it is. It kind of comes with the territory. And to me, that's scary. And the mother of two young men, they grew up in this work. My focus has mostly been sex assault, and they were able to participate in activities and meetings that I went to. I would bring them right along, but I wanted them to be clear and to understand what it means to be a young man, what it means to treat, how to treat young women, how to treat their partner. You know, what are your boundaries? And if we're not teaching them, they're learning by what they're seeing, they're learning by what they're hearing. The other pieces of long-term impact of dating violence is sexually transmitted infections, unwanted pregnancy, we know that of young women reporting domestic violence at the hands of their boyfriends, 66% also experience some form of birth control sabotage. And I've seen this in both teenagers and adults. That is a way a perpetrator takes control of their victim and is using that birth control sabotage. So maybe hiding their pills, taking their pills, if they're using condoms, poking holes in the condoms, because once they are pregnant, then they'll be more dependent on that partner, right? Or that's their intent. That's the perpetrator's intent. And we know that many times that ends up what's happened. There's school and work problems, depression. So being able to focus on school, being able to focus on work, or even have a job, or get a job, or maintain a job, those are all pieces of the dating violence. You know, if your partner is texting you 50 times an hour, or demanding that you talk with them every so often so he can check up on you, you know, those are pieces of the pie of the cycle of abuse. And that interferes with that victim being able to focus on school or focus on work. We also know that there's some spyware out there as well, and I'm just looking for it. I had found it yesterday. There's apps that you can put onto someone else's phone. So if your partner is, you know, insisting that he knows what the passcode is for the victim's phone, that can be dangerous. Wanting to go through your phone to see who you've been talking to, who you've been texting, who you've been talking with on Facebook, maybe your social media sites as well. Those are all going to isolate you. You may end up in a depression. And we know teenagers have high emotions anyway. So feeling depressed, feeling like, man, is this all I'm worth? Is this the best I can do with my life? Feeling bad about yourself. We want to do what we can as adults to help them through this process. I'm just going to share with you, and maybe Lynette, would you be able to type in to the chat, I'm sorry, the SPY app? There's two of them. One is M as in Mary SPY, and the other is Flexi SPY. And if you have a chance, just check out the websites and or Google the spyware apps, and you'll be able to see some of them will take, the perpetrator will be able to take photos from your phone. So if I had the spyware on my cell phone, say my partner put it on there, and it only takes like, I think, a minute or 30 seconds or something to download it onto a cell phone. So it can be done quickly, it can be done easily. Then that person would be able to take pictures of me. They could record my voicemail or my conversations, my phone conversations. They could read my text messages coming in and going out. It's scary how much technology, how far technology has come, and how easily accessible it is. It can be great if it's used in the proper way, but we're talking about dating violence, we're talking about abusive behavior, and when those become a factor, the risks are very, very high for victims. We know also perpetrators will talk about what the victims are wearing. You know, do you have to wear that? Isn't that blouse a little too tight? Or your jeans a little too tight? They use privilege. Treating you, deciding what you're going to do, where you're going to go, you know, who you're going to associate with. They use intimidation, even the threatening looks. Remember the look that your mom used to give you when you made her mad or you did something wrong, that look. Well, perpetrators have that look also, or they use gestures to frighten you or scare you. They might be explosive. So it's like, I had one victim tell me that she said, you know, it's not all the time, it's probably every 3 to 6 months, and he explodes. So she could identify a pattern, and we know that abuse is a pattern of behavior, right? She could identify that pattern, and she used the words explosive. Well, no, it was him being physically violent with you, which is a crime, because if he walked down the street and did that to anyone else, he would probably be arrested. To clarify this with the youth, many teens that I had talked with that were in abusive relationships talked about how the perpetrator destroyed property. And somehow in our conversations, it was identified that the property he's destroying is never his own. It's never his CDs, it's her CDs. It's her her property that he's destroying. Spreading rumors. Rumors are horrifying, and I think if you are in any school setting as a youth, you're trying to grow into who you want to be. And during that time is a delicate time, and when the perpetrators or abusers are threatening to spread rumors, that can be really scary as well. And the rumors, youth and children can be really brutal sometimes. They might threaten to leave you. They might threaten to commit suicide. That's a common tactic of an abuser, threaten to commit suicide. And then you're left with that guilt, right? Biting or threatening to bite. I know that's been common, where perpetrators have bitten hands or their legs. But again, generally they try not to leave marks, or leave marks where it might be exposed, because they want to keep it under wraps. Displaying extreme jealousy, we talked a little bit about that. Calls them names, maybe hoe, whore, slut, stupid. They might use insults and put-downs. Playing mind games. We know that's a form of abuse as well. That's a piece of it. That playing the mind games, making the victim feel like it's their fault, twisting the truth, and that's when victims start doubting their own feelings, doubting their choices and reality, and you kind of feel, I call it crazy making. It kind of feels like am I, did I really do this? And just twisting the truth. And that can be really scary. And if you're trying to figure it out on your own, you're trying to, grow into your own person, at the same time you're learning about relationships by being in relationships. And youth in an abusive relationship can be really dangerous, because what do they get used to? They get used to that behavior, and as they grow into adults, they get into other abusive relationships, because that's what they understand. That's what they're comfortable with. They may not like it. They certainly don't ask for it, and it doesn't mean that they deserve it in any way, shape, or form. But they tend to get into those relationships as adults, because they're seeing it around them, they're living it. Even the isolation, when we talk about that, I talked a little bit about their friends and their relationships with other young adults or young teenagers. But it also ruins their relationships with friends and family. I've seen many, many times where it puts the wedge between the victim and her parents. in her mother or her father or her auntie or her uncle, that stable adult, that healthy adult that's in their life, the abuser doesn't want that healthy person in their life because that's a threat to their ability to continue on with being abusive. Some of the other ways, the impacts and long-term impacts of dating abuse, we talked about that look that your parents might give you when you're in trouble. Well, when you have an abusive dating partner, you know, there's looks that he may give you to make you feel uncomfortable, like he's undressing you with his eyes, or pushing you to be sexual with him when you're not ready to. Makes unwanted sexual advances. He might even make fun of you or talk in a way that embarrasses you or humiliates you. He may coerce you to look at or model for pornography. You know, I just talked about the school of my neighboring town here, and the school had found that youth were sending naked pictures of each other. You know, sometimes they were, I believe that most of them were coerced, that it's an expectation that, well, if you love me, send me a picture, and then you break up, what happens to that picture? That picture doesn't go away. He might pass it on to his friends, and that's what they found were happening. That was happening in the school, and as a result, they had canceled that last football game just yesterday, I think, or yesterday or the day before. So it's important that we're intervening in any way possible that we can to say, hey, you know, first of all, that's considered child pornography, and whether you're a teenager or not, if you have a photo of an underage person that is naked, that's considered child pornography. And they can be in trouble, and it's, you know, different consequences in different areas. But I do know of a few people that have been charged with that as well. The other thing is what we haven't talked about, and I'm not going to get into it too much. I think that's a whole nother topic, but forces the victim into prostitution. And, you know, they find that it's an easy way to make money. It gives them a sense of power. It gives them a sense of control. And once they have the photos, once they are able to help that victim believe that they're going to spread rumors or tell what you did, videotape you during a sexual act, they can use that against you, and they do. They use it to control that victim. Perpetrators also minimize, deny, and blame you for their perpetration, that you caused it, you made me angry. If you wouldn't have been talking to Joe, I wouldn't have gotten so angry that I hit you. That sort of thing. It's very similar to adults in some ways. And also they have the unique situation where they're relying on you or relying on that abusive partner for transportation, perhaps. They're limited resources because they are youth. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the important factors and proactive factors, or how we can intervene, things that we can do in our positions with a child and youth program. I know I had a long conversation with one of the traditional counselors in an area that I had worked, and the traditional counselor had called me. I had just developed a sexual assault advocacy program and was still in the midst of developing it, a very new program in their community. And he called me over to the school where he worked, and he had talked about how it was a common practice for the young women to perform oral sex on the young boys in exchange for money. And he just didn't know where to turn, what to do. And I remember the conversation with him really was disheartening for both of us, because it wasn't an overnight solution. And I've seen it in other areas as well. But I think the most protective factors that had come to my mind was it had to be a comprehensive response. It had to come from all areas. And I remember telling him, I can come to the school and present to the school on dating violence and abusive, red flags in abusive relationships, and, talk about those sorts of things. But when they go home and they're experiencing it at home, or they're seeing it at home, or they're seeing it with their neighbors, they're seeing it in their community, what I say for an hour once a week or once a month isn't going to have much of an impact. However, it doesn't mean that it's not an important piece of it, because you have to set them in the right direction. You have to let them know that that's it's a gift, and you have to turn towards tradition. And I think that traditions will help to keep the abuse at bay. I think we need to involve the elders in our community We need to involve the community as a whole. They need to be getting that same message from everyone around them, that that's not acceptable behavior. And I think traditions such as coming of age ceremonies, each tribe is a little bit different, but identifying some of those coming of age ceremonies are important pieces of letting youth understand why is that sacred? Why is that an important piece? Why do we have a choice? Everybody else is having sex. What's the big deal? It's minimizing that act. And when we're exposed to violent behaviors, and when it's accepted within the schools, when it's accepted within the community, it takes a village, to raise a child, right? We've talked about that before. It takes the entire community, the elders, the community, to step in and bring some of those traditions back. The moon ceremony, I know one of the tribes, actually I think there's a couple tribes that have identified the moon ceremony for young girls, that when they get their moon, when they're on their cycle, it's a sacred time and why it is, and they have a whole ceremony for that. When we start tapping into our traditional ways, that's going to be intervention, because those behaviors, those ways, those things that we're learning, the abusive power and control tactics are not part of it at all. So it's coming at it from a positive aspect. It's coming at it from a different way. But it's important that we're teaching to honor yourself, honor your rights, honor your right to own your own feelings, honoring your right to relationships with friends of both sexes. I used to tell the youth that I worked with, it's important that you're having friendships and relationships with other peers, because you learn so much about yourself as a person. But that does not mean that you are intimate. That does not mean that you're sexual with every one of your partners. It means that you're learning about yourself, what you like, what you don't like, what's acceptable behavior, what's not acceptable behavior, those sorts of things. So often we're taught about gender stereotypes, and when you teach traditions, that kind of contradicts the gender stereotypes. Because you look at the stereotypes for boys or young men, they should be macho, they should be aggressive, they should be in control of the relationship. They're taught, once a man is aroused, you can't control yourself. Or they're taught, all guys want sex, when that's not necessarily true. or they're taught to be emotionally reserved. Don't talk about your feelings. Don't, don't let her know that you're sad. Don't talk to the guys. The guys will laugh at you if you talk about, if you're showing that you're vulnerable. That completely contradicts what we're taught from our traditions and from our culture. We're taught girls should be timid or submissive, keep your man happy, or maybe that if they're not willing to be sexual, if they're not ready to be sexual, maybe they're just a tease, or maybe they're easy, where when we pull in our culture and our traditions, that contradicts all of those behaviors, all of those gender stereotypes. And so it's important to know your area. It's important to know what, in the community that you're living in, what are some of those cultural pieces? What are some of those traditions that will combat some of those behaviors and stereotypes? Will you go ahead and ask that question?
Yeah, if we could have participants go ahead and look at your chat bar, and in your chat bar you can answer. We'd like to know how many of you currently have a children and youth program. And if you could chat that in, that would be great.
I'd also like to take this time just to take a quick break, or to ask if there's any thoughts or comments that you have at this point from what we've covered. And what do they need to do to unmute? Star 6.
Alicia, if they want to unmute, how do they do that?
I will unmute the few people who have called in. Only 3 people have actually called in, so everyone else can type into the chat box, or if they would like to call in, there's a phone icon at the top of the screen, and if you click on it and click Connect My Audio, you can enter in your phone number there and the system will call you. But I will unmute everyone who is in the room so far.
Thank you.
Yeah, so if any of you have any questions or comments to what we talked about at this point before we move forward, please go ahead and ask it now, whether it's in the chat box or if you've called in. I'm more than happy to try to answer some of your questions. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and move forward. Please go ahead and type in your questions if you have them at this time. And I just want to add one more thing before we move forward, and talking about when we're working with youth. So we're going to move on a little bit to working with youth and how and what we can do. But clarify your perceptions, having them clarify what their perception of consent is. What is it? What does it look like? What does it sound like? and what does it feel like? And clarifying their perceptions of what non-consent is. What is it? What does it look like? What does it sound like? What does it feel like? I think those non-consent and consent clarifications are fairly simple. I know one of the things that I've talked with youth about many times is it's not something that they have stopped and actually thought about. And so, I mean, youth are so, oh my gosh, they're resilient. They will keep you on your toes. When I was working with the teens, I was working with a large area, but it was like 5 different schools. I believe it was about 5 different schools, and out of those 5 schools, we had identified 47 teens that wanted to gather and really talk about teen dating violence. They're the ones that came up with the name for their group, TADA, Teens Against Dating Abuse. And they did that within like 5 minutes. I, of course, had to provide the pizza, but well worth it. But getting those healthy youth or youth that wanted to walk that right road, you know, they had all seen something. They had all either seen something, experienced it, or had knowledge of it happening within their schools, you know, the teen dating violence. And so they already had thought about it, seen it, or experienced it by the time I had gotten to them. So education is helping to stop abusive relationships. Include your elders. You know, elders are more than willing to work with you. They're more than willing to participate in youth activities. And why is education important? Because school culture will either promote...
Yeah, I'm on.
Hello? School culture will either promote or discourage teen dating violence. So you're kind of on one side. Schools are, you know, one side or the other. They need to either be proactive.
We have a Mary Olson, but
victims may be minimizing or not realizing the relationship is abusive, and schools need protocols in place to protect them. So there was one school that I had worked with. I heard it over and over and over from the students that, yeah, we see it all the time. Teachers don't intervene, you know, for whatever reason. And the teachers were like, yeah, we see it, but we just try to get them through each day, you know. Well, protocols have to be in place to protect those victims. We don't want those victims losing their education because they are fearful throughout the day because of running into their abusive partner or ex-abusive partner. We know that youth are still teachable, right? That's a good thing. They're still teachable. Domestic violence is a learned behavior. It can be unlearned. They can be given the proper skills they need to have the opportunity to change their behavior. And the victims can have the opportunity to learn what it's like to be in that healthy relationship. We want to encourage the traditional ways because living in balance will only help them throughout their lifetime, right? You know, I'm not sure if any of you are from Alaska, but it reminds me of Alaska, what some of the villages do during the whaling season is it takes the entire village during that time, during whaling season, and they rely on one another. Each person in that village has a role, because if they don't get that whale harvested within a certain period of time, they may not eat over that winter. You know, that's their food, that's their oil, that may be parts of their clothing, maybe their shoes or moccasins, different things. But that's kind of what it reminds me of to stop abusive relationships. It reminds me of the Alaskan villages that work together in balance during whaling season. And if they don't work together, kind of all just falls apart. Define what's honorable. What does that mean? Getting the youth to step back and really see and just take a little bit of time clarifying what healthy relationships are. What does being honorable mean to each of them? You know? I wanted to share with you a little bit when I had organized the Teen Dating Violence group, ta-da. One of the things that we did many things. First, they came up with a name. But before they even did that, I had identified the groups of teens within the areas. So I was able to go into the health class, into physical ed class, into the different classes, and let them know that I wanted to pull together this teen group, dating violence group. And I just talked a little bit about it. Once I was able to identify or gather those teens, we would meet after school. The first thing I did was we defined what is teen dating violence, what is sexual violence, what is domestic violence, and we gave terminology so that we were all on the same page. We talked about it. What does it mean? What does it look like? What are the definitions of each of them? And they were brilliant. They were brilliant. And then that's when they came up with a name for their group. After that, we talked about what they wanted to do. What did they want to see happen within their school? Because like I had mentioned, they had all seen it many times before or experienced it or seen it in their homes. And we talked about what they were seeing. We talked about what they were seeing in the schools, what they felt was accepted behavior. And we also talked about what the responses to the violence by other peers were by adults. We talked about what the responses were to the violence by other peers. So that gave them and me a sense of how acceptable was it within their environment. And then we talked about what are some of the solutions. You know, we knew that because adults might be modeling it or not intervening at all, that was an issue. So we talked a lot about what is going on, identifying what's going on right now around them, and what can they do. So we talked about looking at their school policies. What are their policies around dating violence? And we know that children of all ages and adults have that right to live violence-free, that they should not be living in fear, ever. We know that violence, whether it's dating violence, whether it's sexual assault, whether it's domestic violence, domestic abuse, which is multiple acts, sexual abuse, any of that is unacceptable behavior. And it's a crime. So it's not just not acceptable behavior, but it's a crime. And they each carry different consequences depending on what it is that they do, right? And so we had this conversation with the youth. I could barely keep up with them. They did posters on healthy relationships. We tried to keep a positive response, a positive spin on everything that we did. But we wanted to make sure that there were safe places that they could turn to also. So I kind of did a mini advocacy training with the youth. And I did that for a couple reasons. One is because we know that victims don't generally tell, much less tell an adult. They go to their other peers. So I wanted that other youth to be armed with tools that would help them to seek adult interventions. But there are many things that we did as a teen group. The posters around the school, there was parades every year, so we had a float in the parade. We had honor dances at the powwows. We did several things to bring out that, to make sure that we were talking about it and it wasn't going to be kept a secret anymore. So what information do you need to know before gathering a teen dating violence group? What do you want to accomplish? Why do you want to accomplish it? How are you going to accomplish it? For those of you that have a teen dating violence program, you may already be using your grant as a guideline as far as what you want to accomplish. And in the midst of things, you may find that you need to focus more in one area than another. Brainstorm with the youth. This is their group. Let them be the advocate. Let them be the experts in their area. they know what they're living, they know what they're seeing every day, and many times they have the solutions. So as adults, we can help identify what those solutions are. We had some small trifold cards. It was about the size of a business card. So we put on there what to do if you've been sexually assaulted, what to do if you're in an abusive relationship, what are some of the resources that you have, what are some of the risks if you've been sexually assaulted. They came up with songs, they came up with poems, they came up with PSAs. The local radio station might be able to record them. Maybe you have colleges nearby that'll be willing to help with those PSAs. Let them come up with real-life scenarios and how to respond. Just simply making that time and that space available to have that conversation with them is a vital piece of it. Get them involved in letting them review what the school policy is to ensure that it addresses teen dating violence. And what are the consequences? What are the consequences if a teacher sees it happening, sees the boyfriend slam his fist into the locker right next to the girl's head, scaring her in some way, shape, or form? What are the teacher's responsibilities and how can they be improved? Help them to identify where they're going to meet, meet once a week at the school, meet once a week at the community center, making sure transportation isn't an issue. Not all of them are in after-school activities. Sometimes there's activity buses that are available. Take that into consideration when you're trying to pull the group together. What information are you going to need from the parents? And what type of application form are you going to need? And I'll talk, actually, I've got that in the next slide. The application form, this is just an example of one that I had used, making sure there's an emergency phone number or contact. And then I had come up with a couple questions. What do you hope to learn and accomplish from participating in the Teen Dating Violence Program? Describe yourself within 3 words. This helps you as a facilitator to know where they're coming from. Whether they're describing themselves in a positive way or negative way. What are some of their hobbies or interests? Knowing what their strengths are or their interests are. There might be, maybe they like video equipment or photography. Maybe they can come up with a social media area where there can be a support group for teens, on social media, and who's going to monitor that. Talk about those sorts of things. But this will help to get you started in an application, or maybe interviewing them or talking with them to find out who's interested in participating and who's not. So at your first teen dating violence group meeting, you want to for sure talk about mandated reporting. Know what your mandated reporting laws are in your area. And you, as a facilitator, what are you responsible for? Talk with them about a meeting place. Maybe your ideas might not be the best, and they might have something better that'll work for them. They kind of know, they very much know what their limitations are or aren't. Discuss issues they see in the community, in their school. We talked a little bit about that. What are, not necessarily what's happening in their homes, but asking them what they see in school, and then what are they seeing in the community. And, sometimes things might be flowing really good for them. And they like it that way. Or maybe they know somebody that's been in an abusive relationship. Maybe one of their friends, they're great young advocates. Again, define what sex assault is, what domestic assault is, and abuse. And again, abuse is that repeated behavior. Assault is a one-time action. You're going to want to set up some rules. What are some rules? Maybe confidentiality rules during those meetings so that people can talk, participants can talk openly, that they're not going to talk about what was what Cinnamon disclosed during our teen dating violence meeting. Let them come up with the rules, but make sure there's safety rules and there's confidentiality rules. Define what respect is, and what type of decision-making process are you guys going to have as you move forward. Maybe it's, group decisions. Maybe you have two leaders of the group, and they're a chair or two co-chairs for a month at a time or 3 months at a time. And what are their responsibilities? Maybe it's helping them to move the group forward in some of those decisions. Dating Bill of Rights. I had the students that I was working with, we talked about a Dating Bill of Rights. Before we're sending them out into the community, making posters and being proactive and intervening, we want to arm them with tools, and making sure that they are aware of what their rights are, that they have the right to refuse a date, they have the right to go to parties and dances alone, that they have the right to go to want physical closeness, and that they have the right to ask. They have the right to deny physical closeness at any time. And, having the conversation with them and going over this Dating Bill of Rights, it's something that may seem really simple to us, but it may be something that they haven't taken the time just to stop and think about, even if it's for a few minutes, to process, yeah, I have the right to make a decision and to have that equal relationship within my dating relationship. Go over those relationship warning signs. You know, many of us know what they are already, but they lose their temper quickly. They have a history of fighting. You know that if they can do it to somebody else, maybe they can do it to you. Humiliating you, again, destroying personal property sometimes. Most of the time, it's other people's property, but never their own. Criticizes you in front of your friends, pressures you about sex, scares you with violence, making excuses for his violent behavior, and of course being physical, hitting, punching, slapping, kicking, biting, threatening them. Go over their relationship warning signs. And this is important to do with the group as a whole. And then last but not least, teen safety planning. Talk to them about setting a text message up of somebody they can send a text if they feel scared. It's a little bit different than safety planning with adults, but safe places to go, code words they can use, people they can call for help, things that they've done in the past that's helped keep them safe, identifying safe adults. Who has been a safe adult in their life? Making sure that they're consciously identifying who those safe people are in their life. Why are they safe? Have that conversation with them. And I want to recognize that we have about 2 minutes left of our session today, so if there's any additional questions, please type them into the chat, and I will be happy to answer them. Teens, help them to identify what they can do to help a friend. Listen, believe, refer. Refer to the local domestic violence program. Refer them to a safe adult that can help them. Refer them to the school counselor. But teens are going to go to other teens for support before they go to adults, more than likely. So we want to arm the youth with tools. But we don't want them taking things into their own hands that might put them in harm's way. We always want them to go to the adults. There's a question. Do you get a parent signature allowing teens to participate? Yes, I did. I wanted the families to know that we were talking about domestic violence, teen dating violence, sex abuse, sex assault. One, this gives a heads up to parents when their teenager comes home and says, well, Mom, you know what I learned today? So that they can also be prepared. So definitely want to let the parents give their permission. And just a brief description in that signature page is describing what are some things you're going to do with the teen group. What are some activities that you might be going over with the youth? So with that, if there's no other further questions, I want to acknowledge that our time is up today. But thank you for participating. If you have any other further questions, please feel free to contact myself or Wynette, and we'll be happy to respond as quickly and efficiently as we can. So with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap up for the day. Thank you and have a great rest of your afternoon.